Welcome to this, our sixth in our series of InFocus talks on various Rotary topics, particularly our areas of focus. And tonight we are talking about our very important and number one priority, End Polio Now. And I am pleased to invite our End Polio Now coordinator, Keith Paver, to introduce our speaker.
Good evening, everybody. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Carol Pandak to you. Carol is speaking to us all the way from Chicago, and she began her interest with polio and its eradication in 1997, which is frighteningly 25 years ago, when she was working with our PolioPlus program as a supervisor. Shortly after that, she completed her doctorate and was recruited to the American Academy of Pediatrics to manage a program to improve access to healthcare for infants and children in need. And I suspect partly as a result of that, 3 years later, she was invited back to Rotary as the director of the PolioPlus program, an offer she felt compelled to accept. Polio work does that to you. You say yes when people ask you. And she has been a director of the PolioPlus program ever since. She also notes that 4 of her colleagues have been involved in the program as long as she has. The entire team, the PolioPlus team, and that includes all the End Polio Now coordinators internationally and in our districts, are inspired by the work of Rotarians across the world, who have all been captivated by the dream of a polio-free world and motivated by the possibility of having a lasting impact on the lives of children everywhere. I'm going to say no more. Carol leads a very busy life working across the world in our program of eradication, but over to her, she's to hear what she has to say.
Thank you very much, Keith, and it's wonderful to be with you this evening. I'm going to share my screen in order to show my presentation. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about this evening is, can we make progress towards a polio-free world during the COVID-19 pandemic? And I'm going to start by describing the polio eradication infrastructure that Rotary has helped build, how that infrastructure is helping to support the COVID-19 pandemic response, what the impact of COVID has been on polio, and then talk about the status of our polio eradication efforts. Now, just as a reminder, Rotary is a core member of the Global Polio Eradication Initiative. We're a founding member, actually. And the Global Polio Eradication Initiative was founded in 1988, 3 years after Rotary launched its PolioPlus campaign in 1985. The founding members are Rotary, the World Health Organization, UNICEF, and the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation joined in 2007 when they made their first $100 million grant to PolioPlus and the Rotary Foundation, and Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, joined in December of 2019. So the polio eradication infrastructure, in my mind, is really made up of 2 main components. The first component is the front lines. Who is working on the front lines? There are hundreds of thousands of vaccinators that go house to house, door to door, mosque to mosque, multiple times per year, looking for every child under the age of 5 to immunize against polio. Now, these vaccinators are complemented by what we call community mobilizers. And these are, like the vaccinators, largely women who live in the communities in which they work, who in between polio campaigns are going amongst community members, talking to parents about the benefits of not only polio immunization, but immunizations more broadly, and sharing messages about nutrition, hygiene, et cetera. And these hundreds of thousands of frontline healthcare workers are really supported by thousands of medical officers. And these are essentially the technical experts, the doctors, the nurses that are providing the technical guidance for the program. So the other element of the infrastructure is the global laboratory network. And there are 146 specialized laboratories across the world that are focused on polio, or polio and measles, and polio, measles, and rubella. And these, of course, are testing all of the samples that are taken from suspected cases of polio not only of polio in children, but also are collecting specimens from environmental surveillance sites. There are thousands of surveillance medical officers that go out into the community when there is a suspected case of polio to take a sample and to determine if it is indeed polio. And then there are thousands of laboratory technicians who are testing those samples to determine if they are indeed cases of polio. So when the pandemic first hit back in January of 2020, the entire infrastructure that Rotary has helped build, the support to the frontline healthcare workers, the laboratory networks, all of the people involved pivoted to continue working on polio, but also to help support the COVID-19 response. So all of those frontline workers, the medical officers, the social mobilizers, they were helping to coordinate outbreak response, educating communities on how to stay safe from COVID, investigating cases of potential COVID symptoms, training of health workers, and doing contact tracing for COVID, just like we do for polio. So if there's a suspected case of polio, then of course you want to see who else that person has been in contact with. So this went on for a couple of months. And then in March of 2020, because the pandemic was really ramping up, the Polio Oversight Board took a very difficult decision to pause polio immunization activities to keep communities and healthcare workers safe. So during this pause from approximately March of 2020 to August, September of 2020, certain activities for polio continued. So the surveillance activities continued. So surveillance medical officers were still investigating potential cases of polio. Routine immunization, while it was depressed somewhat because of COVID, did continue in many places. We ensured that the vaccine supply was well positioned so that when vaccination campaigns resumed, the vaccine would be where it was needed most. And we continued to provide some additional services to the communities most in need to help support their broader healthcare needs. But in August of 2020, the first polio campaign after the pause resumed in Pakistan. And at this point, all frontline healthcare workers were equipped with personal protection equipment, including masks, hand sanitizers, and special strategies to keep both communities and frontline healthcare workers safe while they were out doing their work on polio. So how else has the polio infrastructure helped support the COVID-19 response? And we can think about this as the plus in PolioPlus. So now that vaccines are becoming available in more and more countries, so COVID vaccination information is now being provided during National Immunization Days for polio. A very concrete example is that the call center that has been established in Pakistan to take calls from parents and community members about polio is also taking calls for COVID. Polio logistics officers that ensure that polio vaccines get all over where they need to be are also positioning not only personal protection equipment, but also COVID vaccines, ensuring that they get to where they need to go. And then polio medical officers are training vaccinators to give the COVID vaccines along with polio. It's the polio infrastructure includes what we call our National PolioPlus committees. And these are our Rotary members in the polio affected and high risk countries that can continue to work on polio immunizations. And so, for example, in Nigeria, they put up billboards to encourage people to stay safe from COVID. In Ethiopia, they engaged with the religious community to share messages about keeping safe from both polio and COVID. In Pakistan, they provided personal protection equipment to frontline healthcare workers. Here's a picture from Mali where they've installed hand washing stations at the bus station. And then in Nigeria, they helped to register community members for COVID vaccinations in those communities that don't have access to the internet for registration. So where are we today? This infrastructure has helped really drive progress in polio eradication. So in 1988, when the World Health Assembly adopted the resolution to eradicate polio, there were 350,000 cases of polio every year in 125 countries. And in 2021, there were only 5 cases of polio, and 4 of those were in Afghanistan. And of those 4 cases in Afghanistan, 2 of them were in the same household. So geographic spread was quite limited. And because of Rotary's polio eradication efforts and that of our partners, 20 million people are walking who otherwise would have been paralyzed. And this graph just shows the trajectory of polio cases since 2015. You can see how the cases were quite low in 2015, 2016 through 2018. There was a spike in cases in 2019. This was largely due to a false rumor about the safety of the vaccine in a particular area of Pakistan, where they had to pause vaccinations for about a 6-month period until they could manage the damage control around that particular situation. In 2020, of course, we had COVID, and we had a slight pause in campaigns in 2020. But in 2021, we've seen great progress, again, with only the 5 cases reported. And so far this year, there's been 1 case reported in Paktika, Afghanistan. So in June of 2021, the Global Polio Eradication Initiative launched a new strategic plan called Delivering on a Promise. And it has 2 goals. And the purpose of the new strategy is really to address the remaining hurdles to achieving eradication. So it has 2 goals. One is to permanently interrupt transmission of all polioviruses in the endemic countries of Afghanistan and Pakistan. And the second is to stop transmission of the variant poliovirus type 2 virus that I will talk a little bit about later, and prevent outbreaks in polio-free regions. So what still needs to be done to achieve a polio-free world? And I get this question a lot because with so few cases in so few countries, people want to know why we still need to fundraise for polio eradication at the levels that we do. Well, even though only 2 countries are reporting cases of wild poliovirus, we do have the outbreaks of variant type 2 virus. So we need to continue to immunize up to 400 million children per year in order to sustain high population immunity. And we need to do this almost through the end of our polio program, through the certification of eradication. We need to fund those hundreds of thousands of frontline healthcare workers and community mobilizers who are going door to door and talking to every possible parent about the benefits of immunization. And with so few cases, we need to further intensify our surveillance efforts, looking for the virus not only in people, but also in sewage water, so that we can be absolutely confident that we have stopped the transmission of polio. So what's happening in the 2 remaining endemic countries? Well, in Afghanistan, there's some good news here. Since the change in government, there have been 3 nationwide polio immunization campaigns. And this is particularly important because prior to the change, we did not have access to all children in Afghanistan. Some of the areas were off limits to the program. So for the first time, nationwide campaigns, first time in 3 years, nationwide campaigns were conducted. These were conducted in November, December, and January. There are 4 more campaigns planned for 2022. There was a desk review of the disease surveillance system in Afghanistan to determine if we really are confident in the numbers that we're seeing in Afghanistan, and that review came back very positive. All 26 of the environmental surveillance sites that are in Afghanistan are operational. So we feel pretty confident we're picking up any cases of potential polio. Our goal is to do house-to-house campaigns in all areas of the country. However, since the November campaign, about 18 of 34 provinces have conducted house-to-house campaigns where they're able to go to every single house to look for children. and the balance of the provinces have conducted mosque-to-mosque campaigns. And this is really kind of limits your ability to reach all children, because the very young children do not, their parents don't bring them outside of the house until they're 1 year old or more. So you're missing all the newborns. So lots of advocacy work going on to achieve house-to-house immunizations in Afghanistan. But the good news is, through these nationwide campaigns, we've been able to access 2.6 million children who previously had been inaccessible. And there were about 3.3 million children previously inaccessible. So we reached quite a few more children in the recent campaigns. In Pakistan, we recognized 1 year without a wild polio virus case on January 27th of this year. So that is an extraordinary milestone. There's limited geographic spread of the virus in Pakistan, obviously with only one case being detected. We are continuing to detect wild polio virus in the environment. So we know it's still circulating, so it's too soon really to celebrate. And the goal is to reach, really focus in both in Afghanistan and Pakistan on those children that are considered zero dose, that they have received no immunizations either through the routine immunization system or through the supplementary immunization campaigns. And what's particularly important now is to combat complacency in Pakistan because we can't rest on our laurels. Everybody has to work twice as hard to ensure that we can sustain these gains to interrupt transmission in Pakistan. And our third area of focus, really, in addition to the endemics, are these variant polioviruses that I mentioned earlier. And this is a variant strain of the poliovirus that occurs when the weakened form of the a weakened strain of the poliovirus contained in the oral polio vaccine circulates in under-immunized communities for a long period of time and can revert to a form of polio that can cause paralysis. And a new vaccine called the novel oral polio type 2 vaccine was introduced about 18 months ago to help address this issue with this vaccine, this variant poliovirus. To date, in 2021, there have been 602 cases of this variant poliovirus, and of those 602 cases, 588 are the type 2 variety, and of those cases, 70% are in Nigeria. So we really have a challenge in Nigeria to work on this variant poliovirus type 2. So I guess the bottom line and call to action I share with you at the end of this presentation is to be proud that the infrastructure that Rotary has helped build has helped respond to the COVID-19 pandemic, both prior to vaccinations being available and now while vaccines are becoming more available around the world. Really start to build momentum and excitement about the prospect of achieving a polio-free world, especially as the organization that first had the vision of a polio-free world way back in 1979 when we did our first polio campaign. And now I think is the time when we're seeing so few cases of polio to really elevate Rotary's visibility in achieving a polio-free world and Rotary's role in the effort. There's going to be a crowded field celebrating the achievement of a polio-free world, and we want to make sure that Rotary receives the recognition that it deserves for its extraordinary efforts in polio eradication. And of course, we want to ensure that we reach our $50 million fundraising goal with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation match of 2-to-1 so that we can continue to support polio eradication efforts globally. So that concludes my presentation, and I appreciate everyone's attention, and thank you very much. I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Well, thank you, Carol, for that very succinct and very illuminating talk. You've said as much in 20 minutes as it takes me about an hour to do, so there we are. And I've started my video. I've got a number of questions that came to us before. You've had notice of these, and I think we've got at the top actually the key ones, which are to do with motivation of Rotarians in a country where, of course, we haven't seen a case of polio for, oh goodness me, 1984. I think the last indigenous case of polio in England. So, number one is, what is your key message? I think you've already mentioned this really, but what key message do you have for all Rotarians to keep them focused until the world is declared polio free?
You know, I think now is I think there's two ways I would answer that. First of all, I think it's, now is a good time to think about, there were a lot of analogies between polio and COVID. They're not exactly the same, but the sort of, when polio first came on the scene, people quarantined, movie theaters were closed, people were discouraged to travel. It was, some things very similar to COVID. So I think it's useful to remind people that the same fear that people felt about COVID was the same fear that people felt about polio. And so we can sort of relate our polio eradication efforts to COVID. And also say that if we stopped our efforts now, more than 200,000 children every year would be paralyzed against polio within the next 10 years, and we would completely reverse our progress. So we don't want to see children paralyzed by polio, and so we must stay the course.
Thank you. The next one is more about the general public, which is the question that many Rotarians have to deal with when they're trying to go out and fundraise for polio eradication. They've got the message, but what they want to know is, how do they keep the public interest in polio when, of course, most people today have no recollection at all of its consequences? People younger than us, that is, anyway.
Yeah. So I think, again, now is the time to, everything is related to COVID, right? So again, sharing how scary polio was, similar to how scary COVID has been, but also, conduct lots of activities and raise awareness with the media to talk about what polio was, what it did, how far we've come, what it's going to take to finish the job. I think keeping it front and center by Rotary clubs, by convening meetings and fundraisers and writing letters to the editor will help keep it in the public eye more than perhaps it is now.
Thank you. I think the next question you've already answered. You put a slide that said, how many wild polio cases were there in 2021? Answer is 5. And I think you need you to tell them that. You've told them already. But I think that despite seeing the graphs, and of course you and I look at the graphs in much greater detail as part of our roles, but I think we need to reassure, and this is what the question is, are we still making progress? This is what Rotarians need to feel, that are we still making progress?
Yes, I think the numbers show that we're still making progress. I think another measure of progress is the increasing number of children that we're reaching in the polio, especially in the polio endemic countries. So, for example, in Pakistan, we're reaching 90% of children, and every campaign is better. So the quality of campaigns are improving, the reach of the program is improving. The number of refusals from parents, and there are some refusals by parents for a variety of reasons, those are reducing. So we're reaching more and more children with the polio vaccine. And I think we can see that with the progress in the numbers. And we're also detecting less virus in the sewage system. And so I think we're making progress not only in cases, but also in not detecting as much virus in the sewage systems.
I have to ask people who are out there, if anybody wants to ask a question, can they please put it in the Q&A section? You'll find a Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you could put it there, please. We're going on to questions about Afghanistan, which of course is a country that worries us because of the situation, the political changes and the upheaval. So the first question is, what is the position in Afghanistan? I think you've already said a lot about this, but can you say a little bit more about the position in Afghanistan?
Yeah, it's quite interesting. And it's interesting, historically, the Taliban have been supportive when they were in power before. They have been supportive of the polio eradication activities in Afghanistan. And Mullah Omar, who's, people may remember that name, who was leading the Taliban would write letters of support for vaccinators to carry door to door so children could be immunized. So they have a history of being supportive. Now, recently there have been the ongoing negotiations prior to the change in government, but the peace negotiations that were taking place in Doha. And the polio eradication teams of, especially of the World Health Organization, were in Doha frequently talking to the Taliban at the time about polio campaigns and the need to continue with them. So we've built up a relationship with the new leadership over the past couple of years through that Doha process. And so we already have relationships. We have relationships with the current leadership. And so we can have an ongoing dialogue. It's not like we hadn't been talking to anybody. We had been talking to people. And so the Minister of Health is quite supportive. He is, he's not one of the fighters from the mountains, apparently, but his deputies are. So they're a little more hardline. So it's sort of a negotiation process with them. But I am so impressed with our colleagues from the World Health Organization, UNICEF, who travel regularly to Kabul to have meetings with the leadership and to encourage them, especially to allow house-to-house immunization, because the mosque-to-mosque is just really not going to be able to reach as many children as we need to. So it's looking better.
I've got a supplementary to that one, which is that my question is, are they allowed? We've heard all about how the Taliban are reacting to women's education and so on, but are they allowing the women who make up many of the vaccination teams and so on to continue doing that unhindered?
There are fewer women working in the polio program in Afghanistan right now than previously. It's a challenge. There have been no security incidences, but I mean that's a good thing. Throughout the 3 campaigns, when that was a big concern of the program, but there have been no security incidences, but the number of women on the front lines has reduced.
So this does have an impact on whether people are allowed into houses.
Yeah.
And to do with the Pashtun regulations and so on.
Yeah.
The question to the next one, I think you really showed us about this. How robust are the figures from Afghanistan? I think you said that, made it clear that they are very robust. We're very happy with mainly the surveillance activities.
Yeah, as I mentioned, a desk review took place, and there's going to be a field review with experts taking place likely in April to have experts that go out into the field in Afghanistan to do a more hands-on review of the system. But from what the program can tell, things are pretty robust.
I'd quite like to join those teams, but that's from my personal viewpoint. We're moving on to my professional viewpoint, I suppose. Moving on now to Nigeria, which is, you've already spoken about 70% of the cases of circulating vaccine-derived virus type 2 are in Nigeria. And a question that people will ask, and they ask me, is what is the risk that Nigeria could become endemic again for wild polio virus, which is a distinct thing, of course. But I mean, I think it's a question that people worry about, and maybe we could satisfy them there.
Yeah, I don't think the issue is going to be with wild polio virus in Nigeria. No. They do, regular in national immunization campaigns using the bivalent vaccine, which addresses, the type 1 and type 3. What has been less successful in Nigeria has been the response to this variant poliovirus type 2, or the circulating vaccine-derived poliovirus type 2. I think largely due to COVID, and also due to a sense of complacency after Nigeria and the rest of Africa was declared certified polio free of the wild polio virus, right? And so a lot of attention is being paid now to this type 2 outbreak. There was a big meeting held with the head of the National Primary Healthcare Development Agency, who had really repurposed the entire Emergency Operations Center for polio to COVID. And so there was very little attention being paid to polio. So I think that tide is turning, but they have some ways to go.
I'm looking at the maps of Nigeria. A lot of those cases are in the northern part of the country as well, aren't they? Which is so.
And the north is where the last case of wild polio virus in Nigeria was up in Borno, right? And that historically has been the hotbed of polio in Nigeria. So not surprising to see the same for the circulating.
I'm getting a note from John saying that we're getting plenty of decent questions in the Q&A, and I think perhaps we ought to allow the people who are asking questions from what they've heard to have a go. I mean, we've got other questions that you were presented, but I think maybe if John, you would like to come on and deal with some of these questions that you're getting in the Q&A.
Yes, thanks, Keith, and thank you, Carol, for what you've gone through so far. Now comes the real work for the day. These are the questions you haven't seen, but anyway, quite a range and across quite a range of subtly different topics. Christine Phillip asks, is there still a role for Rotary volunteers to help with the immunisation campaign? She comments on it's a life-changing experience and helps to create passionate polio ambassadors.
Yeah, I think, with COVID, fingers crossed, subsiding, right? Of course, India continues to do national immunization days. India is an interesting place to go to participate in polio immunization activities. Certainly, I know groups that have gone to Pakistan to work on polio immunization activities during the national immunization days. So I think there is still a role. You could travel to Nigeria during a national immunization day to participate. And so we do have our National PolioPlus Committee chairs in those countries that can help support that. And those trips are largely organized, they're 100% organized by Rotary members. They're not organized out of headquarters, but we can certainly help direct people to those people that organize campaigns. And I know there was a group from the Chicago area. They had planned to go to India, I think last year. That got postponed, but they are planning to go as soon as it is safe to do so.
There is a question relating to India, John, that we had, which I think
Sure.
to do with volunteers, and that was at what stage will India switch from using the oral polio vaccine, which volunteers can give, to concentrating on only the inactivated vaccine?
So India has introduced 1 dose of the inactivated polio vaccine into their routine immunization system. So they use both in their routine immunization system. So children get a zero dose, 4 months, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, and 14 weeks, I think. And then they get the dose of IPV also, the inactivated at 14 weeks. But in campaigns are will use the oral polio vaccine until the world is certified polio free.
Okay.
Good. Well, the next question that I'm going on to are sort of related to that anyway. I think I'll ask them in this order. Angela Bretherton's asked, is it really true that Pakistanis, where 68 people were murdered because they were administering the polio vaccine as simply a liquid drop, are they really accepting the COVID vaccination as an injection, which many in the West have refused to accept? And the second question in the same area, in any case, how did or does Polio Now tackle the issue of anti-vaxxers?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It is true. Sadly, it is true that I believe it was in December 2012 was the first incident of polio frontline workers being killed while conducting polio immunization campaigns. It has occurred in Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Nigeria, but most have been in Pakistan. I think the number sadly might be a little higher than 68, but this is why the polio vaccinators are often accompanied by security forces, or that's why the Army and police are now involved in the campaigns to provide that security for the frontline vaccinators. It appears that Pakistan is progressing in their COVID-19 response. And how to deal with anti-vaxxers is, I think, a real challenge. I don't know I have the answer to that. It is a problem as much in the United States, and I would imagine in the UK and elsewhere. So I think it's really quite a challenge, and it's just trying to find those community influencers and people who can talk to people about the benefits of vaccination, and finding those people who can do that.
Thank you, Carol. Yes, a challenge all around, I'm sure. Moving on to money and money raising and so on. I've got 3 questions here. Perhaps if I give you them all, and you may encompass them however you like. How close? Richard Green's asking, how close are we to the 50 million target to achieve the Gates 2-to-1 match? Interesting question, as we're only in February, but anyway, I'm sure you.
I can tell you that.
Hopefully Keith can answer that question.
Give some support around that.
Yeah.
Alan Jagger asks, what's the latest cost for the vaccine? And Derek Rothwell asks, we raise money, the 50 million, 150 million target with Gates match to eradicate polio. In recent years, some of these funds have gone to COVID-19 initiatives. Who makes the decision on how that sort of split is made? So, however you, between the two of you, want to answer that one, I guess.
Well, I was just looking back if I could find the email I should have had from after our last Polio Now coordinators meeting. What I can tell you is that in terms of cash donations to PolioPlus across the world, we are on track at about the same level as last year, perhaps slightly more than last year, although sadly in the UK, we on the last time I looked at the figures, we were down. The biggest problem we've got is the money coming from district designated funds. What many people perhaps haven't realized yet is that until this year, money transferred from district designated funds, which is going towards, it's not a tax, but we try to tell people this is going towards a grant project. It's the biggest grant project we run, but it was matched 100% by the World Fund, which meant that when we got the Gates Foundation matching as well, whatever was transferred from the district designated fund was eventually matched 3 times as much. But this year, the matching has gone down to 50% from the Global Fund. And the amount that's been transferred from district designated funds so far this year is half that of what it was at the same time last year, which means instead of having something like $7 million at this stage last year, we only have about 1/3 of that this year. I mean, and that's a problem. And the message is to districts as well as to clubs that this is our #1 project. It's not a tax on your district designated fund. It is a global grant backed project, and it is our most important project still. And should be considered that way. And to those of you who are giving individually, just keep putting your hands in your pockets, please, because you are doing something amazing. But that's the figures at the moment, and I get the figures regularly and update. Derek and I update the districts, the Polio Now coordinators in the districts, with a regular update of the amount of money that is being raised, both internationally and in the UK.
Thank you, Keith, and obviously still a challenge. On to the other parts of the question, which maybe come back to Carol. Sure. Alan Jagger is asking, what is the latest cost for the vaccine?
That's
and
about
the question about partition of it between polio and other things such as COVID-19.
Yeah, so the cost of the vaccine is about 15 cents a dose on average. We sort of, and we sort of assume that, children need like up to 6 doses of the vaccine. So 15 cents times 6 would be the cost of the vaccine. And then you have the cost, of course, of getting the vaccine to children. That's been estimated to be about 35 to 50 cents, per child each time they're reached. So somewhere between maybe $3+ to fully immunize a child against polio. But in some areas in Pakistan, for example, kids are getting immunized maybe 7, 8 times, 8 times a year just to ensure that their immunity is very high. As far as PolioPlus funds for COVID, I mean, it's largely that the infrastructure, that these people that are working on COVID are sort of splitting their time between COVID and polio. And so the surveillance medical officers that are doing surveillance for polio are also doing surveillance for COVID. And so it's not a total redirect of funding. It is that Rotary funding is supporting more than just polio out in the field. And it's the same, for example, there was just an integrated measles campaign in Pakistan. They did their first measles rubella campaign ever. They reached 96 million children with the measles vaccine. That was the target population. A subset of those, the appropriate age group, were immunized against polio. And so again, some of those workers got supported with Rotary funds because they're working on both polio and measles.
Thank you, thank you. Now we're getting on to, we do try to have some of the focus of these InFocus series of meetings about actions that Rotarians can actually take. And so there's a specific question here in that field from Stuart Mitchell. If you had a blank poster on a whiteboard for a polio event, what strap lines would you put on it?
Ooh.
What I don't know that I understand the question.
So you're designing a poster for a polio publicity event or a polio fundraising event or whatever. You're designing the poster. What strap lines, what headlines would you put onto the poster?
So this is what, for me, right, this is a historic opportunity, right? So this is the second disease, the second human disease in history. Yes. Thank you, Keith. Keeping me honest. Second human disease in history to be eradicated. So I think what appeals to me is being a part of history. And by participating in the PolioPlus program, through donating, through raising awareness, through writing a letter to your editor, is a way to going on a National Immunization Day. These are all ways to participate in history. And I think that is a fantastic thing to be able to say.
Indeed, yes, that's a nice sideways look at where we can come in and really celebrate what we're doing. Now, back to a little bit more of the technical side. Can Kevin Fielding asking, can you explain the different forms of polio? He may mean the different 3 varieties, and although there are not many cases, what are the probability of it transforming into yet another variant?
Was that directed to Keith? Did I hear Keith's name there?
Well, the questions are primarily for you, Carol, but
okay.
It is a virology question. It may be something that you'd rather have Keith answer.
Well, I mean, I can start, and Keith, you can supplement if you'd like. I mean, there were 3 types of polio, right? There were 3 very, very creatively named by the virologists and the epidemiologists: type 1, type 2, and type 3. So type 2 wild poliovirus is eradicated in 2015, and type 3 was eradicated in 2018. So we're left with wild poliovirus type 1 that continues to circulate, and it is the most virulent of the 3 types and causes the most paralysis. This other type of polio that we're seeing, this either circulating vaccine-derived poliovirus, or it's kind of got a new name, the variant poliovirus type 2. As I said earlier, it is caused when the weakened form of the live virus used in the oral polio vaccine circulates in under-immunized communities for a long time and can revert to a form that can cause paralysis. So it's not that like you immunize a child and that child gets paralyzed. It's that you immunize a child who is under-immunized or unimmunized, and then the virus starts passing child to child in a community. And the longer it circulates, the more it has the potential to revert back to a form that becomes that can cause paralysis. And that's why this new vaccine that's been introduced is important, because it is more genetically stable than the current vaccine we're using for the outbreaks of type 2, so that even if it circulates in under-immunized communities, it has less capacity to revert to a type that can cause paralysis. And we're seeing good results from the use of that vaccine in the field. There are field trials going on, large field trials going on to see, how it's acting out in the field. The challenge a little bit right now is that there's a shortage of this new novel oral polio vaccine, type 2, and so we're a little challenged with supply because the supplier's been hit really hard with COVID in Indonesia, and there's only one supplier. So that should be alleviating shortly, so that we can do even more responses with the new novel oral polio vaccine.
Thank you. That's fine. I think we'll get into the details of the virology in a different meeting, Keith.
I think so. No, I mean, it's actually the most surprising thing about poliovirus, wild poliovirus, is how little it changes, despite the fact that it does undergo mutation at a rate greater than that of COVID. And there are many other reasons to do that, to do with something about its what we call replicative ability. In other words, how well it grows in cells, but I'm not going to go any further than that.
Thank you. No, we better move on, Keith. We've got several more questions and not a lot of time.
That's difficult.
But in a related area, Eddie Webb's asking, how serious is vaccine-derived polio? I think probably relating to how badly it affects the children who do happen to get polio from it. Carol, have you?
Yeah, I mean, it like wild poliovirus, it can cause paralysis. I think the good news, so it's serious. It's serious. The positive news is that the number of cases are reducing. So we had in 2020 there were perhaps 1,100, maybe a little over 1,100 cases of this type 2 virus. In 2021. It may be a little bit higher, but 602 cases. So it's reduced by 40%. So we're hoping to see that same trajectory. And if we can get Nigeria under control, that will actually reduce the numbers significantly.
Yeah, excellent. And there's a question here about the wild polio virus in the environment. How long can that virus survive, and what keeps it alive and active, and how can that be eliminated?
Well, my understanding is that it can survive for a couple of weeks, so it's not a long period of time. So if you interrupt transmission in people, I mean, you'll eventually eliminate it everywhere, because they won't be excreting it into the sewage system. So we need to interrupt it in people, and we'll interrupt it in the environment subsequently.
Good, that's good to know. Slightly more general question, but I suppose it relates to the overall size of our programme or activity in our programme. Eve Conway's asking, how can Rotary ensure that the world is vaccinated against COVID-19 as we have done with polio? For example, in Africa at the moment, only about 7% of the population has been vaccinated. Are there lessons to learn from one into the other?
Yeah, I think there is a COVID-19 task force at Rotary, which is chaired by past President Ravi Ravindran, and has public health experts sit on it, who are Rotarians. So they've encouraged, and if you go to the Rotary website, they've encouraged activity in 5 various areas, very similar to what we've done in polio, right, is to advocate for equitable distribution of the vaccine, encourage people to stay safe with PPE, and work with your public health experts to determine what needs to be done and raising awareness about the benefits of vaccination. So really building on the lessons learned in polio to apply those to COVID. We're not necessarily fundraising for COVID, but we're encouraging Rotarians everywhere to be involved in the outbreak response that is most appropriate in their communities.
Good. So there's some real action for us all individually as Rotarians there as well. So thank you for that. Okay. What is just back to money, but it's an important part of what we're all doing. What is the total annual cost of End Polio now, not just the Rotary contribution? We talked about 150 million, but that's a
yeah. So the 2022 budget for polio eradication writ large, which has recently been finalized, is $932 million. So it's significant. And we're just looking now at the multi-year budget going through 2026. And the estimates are pretty similar levels for the future years until certification, with some drop in the outer years of 2025, 26. And the cost drivers are really the cost of the program in the endemic countries, but also the outbreaks of the type 2 virus are also expensive and are a large part of the budget, and as well as surveillance in order to ensure we know where the virus may be circulating.
Excellent, Carol, thank you. There's a lot of extra information there for us all. Now, you were asked that question about the strapline for the poster. We've had a few responses come through on the Q&A as well. How about you can save the children of the world, making history and delivering on a promise.
That one.
I think delivering on a promise is good, and the new name of the strategy of the Global Polio Eradication Initiative strategy, delivering on a promise, reminds me of Rotaries. Like Rotaries, that's our idea, right? We are delivering on our promise of a polio-free world, the promise that we first made before anyone else. So I think that's a really excellent one as well.
And then last sort of blunt, very punchy headline: calipers not needed, over the picture of a skip full of redundant calipers.
Yeah. All great.
So they're
all better than
great, mine. Absolutely. I've had a lot of thank yous come through on the Q&A. John Box, who's one of our district foundation chairs and actually is a polio sufferer from a very young age. But 1948 he caught it. In fact, he dearly hopes to see the eradication of polio, and he enjoyed your very informative talk. So thank you very much. I am going to assure people, I think you're right with this, Carol, we'll circulate your presentation to those who've attended and a recording of the meeting in a few days' time. And we will, within that'll answer questions, one or two questions about some of the detail, the numbers and so on that are in your presentation. That will go out to everyone quite shortly. So really, Carol, I just want to thank you. You've illustrated things extremely well. You've reminded us of the challenge we all still have. It is so important, and thank you for all you've done tonight and all you continue to do for hopefully not too many years into the future. And I won't ask you the awkward question, what you're going to do when you finish it all. So thank you very much indeed, Carol, and we'll see you in the programme again in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now I have the opportunity to hand on to our humanitarian service lead, Cheryl Berry, who will introduce our next talk, which in a month's time. Over to you, Cheryl. Thank you.
Our next focus session is on March the 10th, and we'll be looking at water, sanitation and hygiene. We're delighted and honoured to have as our speaker Aziz Memon. Aziz is a Rotary International Foundation trustee, and he also chairs the Pakistan PolioPlus Committee. As-is has helped to bring clean water and improve sanitation to hundreds of thousands of people in Pakistan. He will be sharing with us ideas and information to help us all to take action and improve water, sanitation and hygiene around the world. Please join us again and invite your community and your family and your friends. These sessions are open to all of you, and it's together that we can make a difference. Thank you.